"Can you give me work?" the lonely little girl asked. Arthur was a man who had become a ghost in his own life, his form as weathered and unyielding as the landscape he inhabited. The lines on his face were carved not by age alone, but by a grief so profound it had settled into his very marrow, hollowing him out until all that remained was a shell animated by the grim mechanics of survival. He moved through his days with a silence that was more than an absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating presence, a constant companion that sat with him at his bare wooden table and followed him as he made his pointless rounds, his boots stirring dust that had not been truly disturbed in years, for the house held its breath, waiting for a life that had long since departed. His hands, calloused and strong, now only performed the most basic of tasks, drawing water, mending the essential, feeding himself without taste or pleasure, each action a reluctant concession to the body's stubborn refusal to quit, a body his spirit had abandoned long ago. The air inside the home was thick with the memory of laughter and love, a memory he fought every day to bury, yet it clung to the faded floral pattern on a forgotten armchair and the faint scent of dried lavender in a room whose door he never opened. The sun would rise, painting the sky in glorious hues he refused to see, and it would set, plunging his world into a darkness that was merely an outward reflection of the one he carried inside, a relentless twilight of the soul from which he believed there was no escape and for which he no longer sought one. His world had shrunk to the size of his loss, and within its suffocating borders, he was content to simply wait for the end. A speck appeared on that endless horizon, a wavering distortion in the heat that shimmered above the plains, so insignificant at first that Arthur, watching from his porch with eyes that saw little, dismissed it as a trick of the light or a wandering animal. But the speck grew, resolving itself with painful slowness into a human form, small and deliberate, moving with a weary but unwavering purpose toward the wound of his property. A deep-seated irritation stirred within him, a resentful guarding of the sacred emptiness he had so carefully curated. Visitors were a violation, their very presence a demand for a response, an acknowledgement of a world he had renounced. He remained seated in his rickety chair, a stony sentinel willing the intrusion to turn aside, to be swallowed by the prairie as all things eventually were. Yet the figure persisted, trudging through the dust, its smallness becoming more apparent with every step, until it was clear this was not a man, but a child. She finally reached the edge of his decaying porch, stopping at the bottom step as if it were the shore of a forbidding sea. She was a slip of a thing, no more than 9 or 10, cloaked in dust that muted the color of her patched dress and hair, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with the memory of tears. In her hand, she clutched a small, tightly wrapped bundle, her only possession in the vast, empty world. For a long moment, she simply stood, catching her breath, her chest rising and falling visibly, and then she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes, startlingly clear and blue in her grimy face, held no artifice, only a profound exhaustion and a flicker of desperate, unblinking hope. Arthur's stony silence was a wall she had to breach, and he offered no help, his glower a clear sign she was unwelcome. Finally, her small, chapped lips parted, and a voice, quiet but not timid, cut through the oppressive stillness that clung to the ranch like a shroud. "Mister," she said, her tone formal and serious. "Can you give me work?" The question hung in the dry air, an impossible request aimed at a man who had forgotten the meaning of the word, a plea for purpose in a place where purpose had died. He stared at the girl, a phantom from a world he no longer belonged to, her simple, direct query an indictment of his own empty existence, a stone dropped into the stagnant well of his soul. His first impulse was a guttural, dismissive sound, the verbal equivalent of shoving her away, and the word no formed on his lips, a fortress gate slamming shut. He told her there was nothing, no work, no food, no reason to stay, that the road she was on continued past his land and she should follow it until she found someone who had something to give, for he was a man who had been emptied. But the child, whose name he would learn was Lily, did not flinch or turn away. She simply absorbed his refusal with a stillness that spoke of a life already familiar with rejection, her small shoulders slumping just an inch, the only outward sign of her disappointment. She looked toward the western horizon, where the sun was beginning its spectacular descent, bleeding fiery oranges and purples across the enormous sky, a daily miracle he had long since trained himself to ignore. He saw her gaze follow the path of the sun, and in her tired, clear eyes, he saw not an appreciation for its beauty, but a primal, rising fear of the coming darkness, of the vast, cold, and predator-filled night that would soon blanket the plains. It was a flicker of raw vulnerability, a terror so naked and honest it pierced through the thick scar tissue around his heart and struck a chord of a memory he had tried to obliterate, the memory of another small face, another pair of eyes that had looked to him for protection. A war raged within him for a long, silent moment, the ingrained habit of isolation battling a sudden, unwelcome upwelling of something akin to responsibility. With a heavy sigh that was a sound of bitter defeat, he gave a curt jerk of his head toward the barn, its great doors hanging slightly askew. "The barn," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "You can have the hayloft for one night. Come morning, you're gone." It was not an invitation, but a temporary stay of execution, a begrudging postponement of her journey. He went inside, the screen door groaning in protest, and returned with a heel of stale bread and a worn woolen blanket, thrusting them into her hands without a word. In his mind, it was a simple transaction to clear his conscience, a debt paid to the ghost of his own humanity, but as her small, dirt-caked fingers brushed against his, he felt an unfamiliar jolt, the first stirrings of a life he thought was long since buried. Arthur awoke to a silence that felt different, somehow less absolute, and his first thought was of the girl in the barn. He rose with the grim expectation that she would be gone, a fleeting footnote in his chronicle of isolation, and a part of him felt a grim satisfaction at the thought of his world returning to its bleak, predictable equilibrium. But as he looked out the grimy kitchen window, a movement caught his eye, a small figure kneeling in the tangled, thorny mess that had once been his wife Mary's garden. It was Lily, her back to him, methodically pulling up the stubborn weeds one by one, her small hands working with a focused, tireless rhythm. She was not asked, not paid, yet she toiled as if reclaiming this small patch of earth from the wilderness was the most important task in the world. He watched her for a long time, a statue at his window, the lukewarm coffee in his mug forgotten. Her simple, unbidden act of creation was a profound and unsettling contrast to his own years of curated decay. He did not go out to stop her. He did not know why. That evening, as twilight softened the harsh edges of the land, he found her sitting on the porch steps, her hands clean but her knuckles scraped. He wordlessly handed her a bowl of thin stew, and they ate in a silence that was no longer his alone, but one they shared. Then, unprompted, she began to speak, her voice soft and factual, recounting a story of a wagon train, a cholera outbreak, and of parents who had been buried somewhere back along the trail. She spoke of being taken in by another family until they, too, decided she was a burden they could not carry. There were no tears, no self-pity, just a quiet recitation of her reality. The starkness of her tale, of a child set adrift in the vastness of the continent, created a small crack in his own sealed-off world of pain. He found himself looking at her, truly seeing her not as an intrusion, but as a fellow survivor of a shipwreck. And from some deep, rusted place within him, a word rose to the surface, a name he had not spoken aloud in 5 years, a name he had believed would turn to ash on his tongue. "Mary," he said, the sound a rough, tearing whisper in the quiet air. It was the name of his wife. He offered no more, but that single word was a confession, an offering of his own brokenness that hung between them, a fragile bridge built across an abyss of unspoken sorrow. The days that followed settled into a new, unspoken routine, a rhythm dictated not by grim necessity but by a shared, quiet purpose. Lily's presence was a low hum of life against the backdrop of his profound silence. He would find her sweeping the porch that had not been swept in years, her small broom raising clouds of dust that caught the morning light like dancing sprites. He would hear her humming a simple, meandering tune as she continued her tireless work in the garden, a sound that had at first been an irritating intrusion but had slowly woven itself into the fabric of the ranch, becoming as natural as the call of a distant hawk. One morning, he found himself standing before his workshop, the door hanging from a single rusted hinge. He looked at his hands, at the callus that spoke of a forgotten competence, and an impulse he hadn't felt in an eternity took hold. He picked up a heavy hammer, its wooden handle smooth and familiar in his grasp, and walked not to the workshop, but to the sagging fence line that bordered the barren fields. He pulled a bent, rusted nail from a post and replaced it with a new one, driving it home with 2 clean, resonant strokes. The sound of the hammer was a shock, a percussive heartbeat in the dead air. It was the sound of building, not decaying. He worked his way down the line, pulling warped boards straight, pounding posts back into the unyielding earth. It was hard, punishing labor under the relentless sun, but each blow felt less like a chore and more like an act of defiance against the entropy that had claimed his world. After a while, he felt a presence beside him and saw Lily, holding out a fistful of nails, her face serious with the importance of her task as his assistant. A silent partnership was formed. He would work, and she would be there, a quiet shadow of support. As he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he watched a prairie dog pop its head from a nearby burrow, chittering at them with bold indignation. Lily giggled, a bright, silvery sound that seemed to startle the very air. "He thinks you're in his yard," she whispered, and for the first time in a lifetime of grief, the corner of Arthur's mouth twitched upward in an expression so foreign he barely recognized it, the ghost of a smile, a subtle and gentle tremor that marked the beginning of a great thaw. The world beyond the ranch had long ago ceased to exist for Arthur, but it had not forgotten him entirely. Doc Hemlock, a man whose face was a roadmap of the county's joys and sorrows, made a circuit through the outlying homesteads twice a year, and Arthur's place was always his final, most dispiriting stop. He rode up expecting the familiar tableau of decay, the same silent, haunted man staring out from the porch of his slowly collapsing life. But this time, something was different. The first thing he noticed was the fence, a newly straightened and mended spine holding the property together. Then he saw the garden patch, cleared of weeds and showing the dark, rich soil of freshly turned earth. And then he saw the most impossible sight of all, a small girl, her hair the color of corn silk, carefully hanging a man's shirt on a clothesline that stretched from the porch to a sturdy oak, a line he was certain hadn't been there 6 months ago. Arthur greeted him not with his usual sullen nod, but with a quiet "Doc," and offered him a cup of coffee on the porch. As they sat, the doctor's shrewd, kind eyes took in the subtle but profound changes. He saw the way Arthur watched the girl, a protective, almost paternal light in his gaze that had been extinguished years ago. Doc Hemlock was a man who understood that the deepest wounds were not of the flesh, and he knew better than to pry. He simply took a slow sip of the coffee, its warmth a small comfort in the vast landscape, and looked out at the mended fence. "Place is looking different, Arthur," he said, his voice a low rumble of approval. "Whole place feels straighter." The simple observation landed with more weight than a sermon. It was an external validation, a mirror held up by a trusted observer, proving to Arthur that the changes he felt stirring inside him were real, that they had manifested in the world of wood and wire and soil. He had not just been mending a fence, he had been mending himself, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that the work was not in vain, that the foundation he was rebuilding, however slowly, was true and solid. The quiet presence of Lily, with her simple questions and her untroubled acceptance of the world, began to excavate parts of Arthur he had buried under layers of impacted grief. One evening, as she sat patching a tear in her worn dress, she looked up at him and asked, "Did you have a little girl, mister?" The question was without guile, a simple curiosity, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow, unlocking a door he had bolted and barricaded from the inside. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself standing before a heavy, dust-covered trunk at the foot of his bed, a sarcophagus of memory he had not dared to approach since the day he'd returned to an empty house. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid, releasing the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and cedar. Inside lay the carefully folded dresses of his wife, Mary, and nestled amongst them, a small, hand-stitched doll with yarn hair and button eyes, its cloth body limp and worn from the love of a small child. He lifted the doll, its weight both insignificant and immense in his palm. The grief came then, as he knew it would, a tidal wave of pain that threatened to pull him under. But for the first time, he did not fight it. He let it wash over him, and when the crest of the wave passed, he was still standing, the doll held safely in his hands. The next day, he found Lily by the creek, skipping stones across the water's surface. He sat beside her on the grassy bank and began to speak, his voice low and halting, as he told her about a little girl named Sarah, a girl with hair like spun gold who loved to sing off-key and who believed this very doll could listen to her secrets. He spoke of her laughter, a sound he could now almost recall without wincing, sharing not just the fact of his loss, but the shape and color of what he had lost. He was giving his memories air, allowing the light to touch them, and in doing so, robbing them of their power to haunt his darkness. When he finished his story, he gently placed the worn doll into Lily's outstretched hands. "Her name is Daisy," he said. She's been lonely for a very long time. The gift was more than a toy, it was an act of trust, a passing of a sacred memory from the dead to the living, and a promise that life, and love, could begin again. Arthur came to understand that Lily's needs were greater than a roof and a bowl of stew. She needed shoes that fit and a dress that wasn't made more of patches than of fabric. This realization forced a decision he had been avoiding for years, a trip into the town of redemption, a place teeming with faces and memories he had actively fled. More than that, it meant facing Thomas, Mary's brother, the town blacksmith. In the immediate, raw aftermath of his loss, Arthur had lashed out, blaming Thomas for some imagined failing, for not being there, and had built a wall of bitter silence between them that had stood for 5 long years. He found Thomas at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on steel a familiar sound from a different life. Thomas looked up, his face hard and wary, the old pain still evident in the lines around his eyes. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations and years of shared, unarticulated grief. Arthur, holding Lily's small hand, felt his old pride and anger begin to rise, but then he looked down at the child beside him, a living testament to his second chance, and the bitterness subsided. "Thomas," he began, his voice rough and unfamiliar with the cadence of apology. "I was wrong. To blame you. To shut you out. I was lost." The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the weight of 5 years of regret. Thomas stared at him, then his gaze shifted to the small, curious girl clutching Arthur's hand. He saw the mended quality in his brother-in-law, the flicker of light in eyes that had long been vacant. The hardness in his own face softened, the tense set of his shoulders eased, and with a slow, deliberate nod, he wiped his hands on his leather apron. The years of resentment began to crumble, not with a great crash, but with a quiet, gradual erosion. He led them to the general store, speaking not of the past but of the present, of the quality of the new denim and the price of flour, rebuilding the bridge between them one mundane, practical plank at a time. As Arthur and Lily left town, their wagon loaded with supplies and new beginnings, Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's good to have you back, Arthur," he said, and the simple words were a pardon, a welcome home to a world Arthur had thought he could never re-enter. The journey back to the ranch felt different, not a retreat into isolation but a return to a place that was now, finally, starting to feel like a home rather than a tomb. The landscape, once a reflection of his inner desolation, now seemed imbued with a quiet promise. With the help of the supplies from town, the transformation of the ranch accelerated. Arthur found a new, invigorating purpose in his work, the kind that looks toward a future. He hitched his long-neglected plow to his steady old horse and broke the fallow ground, the dark, rich soil turning over in fragrant waves, a promise of a harvest to come. He was no longer just surviving, he was building. He began to teach Lily, his days structured around not only chores but lessons. He taught her to properly groom and ride the horse, her initial fear giving way to joyous confidence as she trotted around the corral. In the evenings, by the warm light of a kerosene lamp, he would read to her from one of Mary's old books, his voice tracing the words of stories he thought he'd never read again, while she painstakingly learned to form her letters on a small slate. Laughter, once a foreign and painful sound, began to echo in the small cabin. It was Lily's laughter first, bright and frequent, but soon it was joined by his own, a low, rusty rumble that surprised him each time it escaped. One afternoon, he cleared out the small spare room, the one that had been sealed with grief for so long. He spent a week carefully sanding and joining pieces of lumber, and from them, he constructed a small, sturdy bed frame. He worked with a craftsman's care, ensuring every joint was strong, every surface smooth to the touch. The act of building this bed for her was a silent, powerful declaration, a physical manifestation of his commitment. When it was finished and adorned with a new mattress and a handmade quilt from town, he led her to the room. Her eyes widened, her hand reaching out to touch the smooth wood of the headboard. She didn't need to say anything. He had not just given her a piece of furniture, he had built her a place in his world, a place of permanence and safety. "You belong here," the sturdy bed seemed to say. "This is your home now." The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a delicate wash of rose and gold that gently erased the stars from the deep velvet of the night sky. Arthur stood on his porch, a mug of steaming coffee warming his hands, and watched the daily spectacle as if seeing it for the first time. For years, the sunrise had been nothing more than a signal to begin another day of meaningless existence, but now, it felt like a profound and personal promise of renewal. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant perfume of pine. He heard the soft creak of the screen door and Lily appeared beside him, wrapped in a blanket, her hair still tousled from sleep. She leaned against the porch post, a small, solid presence beside him, and they watched the sun ascend in a comfortable, shared silence. His gaze swept over the ranch, a landscape transformed. The fences stood straight and true, guardians of fields that were no longer barren but neatly plowed and waiting for seed. The house behind him felt solid and warm, no longer a hollow shell but a vessel for life. In the garden, the first tender green shoots were pushing their way through the dark soil, a testament to Lily's patient, hopeful labor. He looked down at the small girl who had wandered out of the vast, indifferent wilderness and into the wreckage of his life. She had arrived with nothing but a desperate need, and in answering that need, he had been forced to confront his own. She had not saved him with grand pronouncements or powerful actions, but with the simple, relentless gravity of her own quiet hope. She had needed a home, and in the slow, painstaking process of building one for her, he had inadvertently rebuilt his own. The profound, aching loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long had vanished, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. He was no longer a ghost haunting the ruins of his past but a man standing firmly in the present, looking toward a future he was now ready to welcome. The sun cleared the horizon, flooding the plains with a brilliant, hopeful light, and Arthur knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his long, dark night was finally over.